Ah, the life of a farmer. Fresh air, fresh meats, and fresh vegetables. Only one of those things were in abundance for the ancient Japanese farmer, and hint, it wasn't the thing that kept their bellies full. In fact, if you were a farmer during the Sengoku period in Japan, there wasn't much food going around at all. Much of your meals probably looked like this: a simple porridge made with various grains. Today, we're gonna make some farmer's porridge and explore the rough and difficult life of the ancient Japanese farmer. So before we give up our modern luxuries like Taco Bell and toilet paper, which, by the way, make a fabulous combination, make sure you hit that like button. Now, as far as I understand, this dish doesn't have a name, and it really hasn't survived the passing of time. You see, Japan has plenty of foods that date back centuries. Take mochi, for instance. Records show that mochi was eaten as early as 300 BC, and it's still something widely enjoyed today. In fact, we actually made a video on how to make homemade mochi, so you can go ahead and check that out if you like. However, this porridge has all but disappeared. In fact, once white rice became the common staple among all classes in Japan, the consumption of many of the grains in this dish are hardly eaten at all. There's millet, barley, green, red, and black rice, along with many others. Despite being nearly absent from the modern Japanese diet, you can still find these grains in a pre-packaged mix at the grocery store. That's what I'm using today to create my farmer's porridge, and while normally these are meant to be mixed with white rice in order to fortify it with more fiber and nutrients, I'm just gonna cook them as is. Add your grain mixture into a pot with plenty of water. Now, I don't think it's necessary to be exact with the amount of water because you can just boil out the excess to thicken it up. Bring the heat up to high, and once it starts to boil, reduce it to medium-low and let it cook. Since the grains are quite firm, 50 minutes to a little over an hour over a low simmer should be enough time, adding more water if necessary. And that's really about it. It's kind of like making oatmeal on the stovetop, and I have to say, this will probably be one of the easiest recipes that I make on this channel. So while our porridge is simmering away, let's see how this meal came to be. Today, we're focusing mostly on the diet of the farmers of the Sengoku period, starting from 1467 to 1615. This is also called the Warring States period. At that time, Japan's central government had collapsed, and local leaders called daimyo warred to gain power and eventually control over all of Japan. It was madness. Constant infighting, civil wars broke out across the country, brothers fighting brothers. Heck, people were pooping in the streets even. Well, they were always kind of doing that, and maybe that's something we'll talk about in a future episode, but still, with the constant bloodshed and poop shed, while they're not completely wrong, there are a couple of other factors that made this period utterly chaotic. Not only was there fighting happening all across the island, but Japan would see harvests constantly destroyed by what is known as the Little Ice Age. This was a period of about 400 years when the Earth became slightly cooler. They were so common that in a 90-year span from 1450 to 1540, there was on average a major famine every 3.7 years. Starvation was rampant during that time. So with the bloody civil wars and famine, things couldn't possibly get any worse, could they?
Oh yeah, here comes syphilis. Here comes syphilis. I'm gonna save the day.
Cool things off in the bedroom with a tall glass of syphilis. Yes, coming all the way from the New World and making a few stops along the way was this newfangled disease that would become an epidemic across ancient Japan. So with the constant bloody battles and inability to sow seeds and the ruined crop harvest, Japan became a land of chaos, starvation, and death.
Bye, snoo snoo!
With much of the country suffering, the daimyo used their military might to seize lands from each other in a desperate bid to not only gain power, but to survive. Taking large plots of land meant that you had access to more farms, which meant that you could actually eat. The humble farmer would have to give up nearly 60% of an already dismal harvest to their local daimyo as an annual tribute, or as we call today, taxes. So with the very best of their crops going to the local leaders, the farmers were left with the cheap and undesirable crops. Now, the taxes were self-reported at the time, so it's quite possible that the farmers kept a little more for themselves, but if they were ever caught, it would most likely mean an extremely harsh punishment or even death. The prized crop, of course, was polished white rice, a food that was only reserved for the upper crust of society. Everybody else would have to eat different kinds of grains, which included barley, millet, and red rice. Red rice especially was consumed quite often because it was easier and less expensive to grow, and it would yield a lot more edible crop than its fancy polished white cousin. Did that sound racist? An ancient Japanese farmer would most often eat this as a porridge since its higher in water content, thus filling the belly more. Along with porridge, they ate whatever wild vegetables that they could find. A leek here, maybe a few mushrooms over there, maybe a piece of slightly moldy fruit. If you were fortunate enough to live near the ocean, you probably spent some of your free time trying to catch some fish for some extra protein. As for the seasonings, if you traded some of your harvest for salt, you would use that to season your food. However, some farmers had enough ingredients to make their own home-brewed miso, which wasn't commercially available yet. This was often served on the side, kind of like its own little side dish. You would take small bites of the miso in between bites of porridge. With all that said, being a farmer at that time was extremely harsh. It was so hard that they were willing to risk their own lives for a chance to eat. In fact, many farmers would take part in war just so they can get a hot and filling meal. I'll be talking more about that in a future episode where I recreate an ancient samurai's MRE. So make sure you're subscribed and you've hit that notification bell so you know when that video comes out. I think our porridge is about done now, so let's go ahead and check it out. And yes, it's simmered into a nice thick consistency. You can see that it has a deep purple color, which mainly comes from the black rice. Now, the farmer's porridge would range in color depending on the grains and additional ingredients they added. So it's quite possible that on occasion, their porridge would turn out looking like oatmeal or like this. Now, to complete this farmer's meal, I'm gonna add in just a little bit of miso on the side. And now that our ancient Japanese farmer's meal is complete, let's go ahead and try it out. Now, this doesn't look that appetizing, I'll admit. Again, the color variation would depend on what the farmer had at the time. And if he had a lot of black rice, it probably would have looked a lot like this. So let's go ahead and try this out. There's no seasonings added. It's just the grains straight from the pot. Tastes like desperation. This is the stuff you give your kid when they're not listening to you. Then they'll hate eating forever. I can definitely see why the ancient Japanese farmers risked their lives to eat a good meal, because if this was the only thing you had to look forward to when you were hungry, starvation might not sound that bad. What you can taste is the flavor of grain. So take a handful of rice and smell it, and that's what this tastes like. Luckily, we do have a little bit of miso here, and what they would often do is they would just take a little bit of it. They would just take oh, that's so strong. Oh. Take a bite of the miso and the porridge. Okay, that's not that bad actually. I don't know about biting it straight away, and from what I understand, people at that time generally preferred much saltier food anyways because they were just sweating all the time. Now, if you were lucky enough to be born into a samurai clan, you were eating way, way, way better than this. I actually recreated a samurai meal over here, so go ahead and start watching that video and I'll tell you more about what the samurai were eating.